Thank you very much to both of you for that warm introduction. I also wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you for being so kind and welcoming me since I've arrived at CBS and also in Denmark. I haven't lived in Denmark for almost 25 years, so it's a big change for me. And I'm also very excited about arriving at CBS, and especially with SMG, because there are so many of you who are working on issues that are related to my research. So it's been an exciting time for me at LBS, but sometimes I've been a bit isolated in my research interests. And here I find that there are many people who are working on similar things, and so I think that will provide lots of future opportunities for collaborations. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is this relational perspective on resource sharing in organizations, which will sort of give you, I thought this would be a good opportunity to give you an introduction to my research. And so what I will do is talk a little bit about what I've done so far in my research, what I'm working on at the moment, and then of course, because I'm not going to retire yet, what I will be working on in the future. And so I hope that would also show you some of the opportunities where perhaps there will be openings for collaborations with faculty colleagues, or of course with the PhD students. Now, in preparing this, it was also interesting for me because I started to think about what am I actually going to talk about? And I thought, well, I'll have to go back to sort of the beginnings of my research agenda. And so I started to sit down and think about where is it actually that these interests come from? And of course, I think, like many of you, some of the interests are personal. I'm quite interested in relationships with people. I'm also very interested in geography, having lived in many different parts of the world. And so I think a lot of that you'll see is reflected in my research, in my teaching, in my outside work. And so I think that's sort of why it becomes so dear to you, and I think that's something for the PhD students to think about. You should only work on things that you really care about and that you find exciting, because you're going to spend a lot of time on it. So what I did was I went all the way back to 1998, which was actually before I even started my PhD. And at that point, I was sort of still thinking about doing an academic career, but I wasn't quite convinced that this is what I wanted to do. Now, of course, I should understand that I was clearly on the path towards an academic career when I decided to study consultants rather than join them. And this is even before my PhD. So the topic that I was really interested in at the time was the sort of classic strategy question of how do individuals and firms compete for resources? And in particular, how do firms between one another compete for resources? And so in order to get a better understanding of this, this question, I went and I spoke to some senior managers in consulting firms in Norway, which is where I was spending part of my time at the time. And what was really interesting to me, what I wanted to see was how do they actually compete for resources between firms. But what also came out in these interviews was the importance of relationships, which was a little bit surprising to me at the time, but of course very curious and interesting. And so here's something, for example, that one of the partners I spoke to said. In a client situation, then it's clear you have a very strong competition from typically other established players. Once you get into the real goodies, for example, that is the interesting strategy projects, then the whole product, what you deliver, is trust. Pure trust, right, and trust is dependent on building up relations. And here's what another partner said. The consulting company managed to build up a very good relation with the client. It is a relation that is more than just a business relation, and this will make it possible to get new assignments without attending beauty contests, as they call them in the consulting world. So basically we're saying, once we build up that trust, once we build up the relationship, we'll be able to maintain that over a long period of time. Now, of course, then, these interviews had really piqued my interest, and I thought, well, is this something that's just going on in this quite small business world that sometimes we see in local communities, or is this something that's applicable at a larger scale? And so this sort of became the beginning of my dissertation project. And so what I did next was to negotiate access to a big consulting firm, and I thought, I want to speak to people across different geographies. Let's see if this also happens in different geographies. It's not something that's a local phenomenon. And let's see what's going on. And so now a few other interesting issues appeared. First, there was this idea of not only do we compete for resources externally between different firms, but we actually also compete inside the firm. So individuals actually have to think about how they compete for resources internally. So here's one of the senior partners I spoke to in London. He said, to get resources, it's important to know managers and partners internally, right? It's just important to have a relationship with people inside the firm. And in fact, they even spoke about how sometimes there was even a black market for resources that might appear. So those relationships are really important. So you have to make sure you have good relationships if you need to get access to funding, for example, if you're doing research projects and so on. I've built a network of people, of relationships in the firm. It can help internal instances like sharing information. Now, of course, many of you will recognize this, right? In lots of companies, they have big knowledge-sharing systems, but a lot of the time, most people actually rely on who they know and who they can call up, and who's the colleague that's closest to them. Another thing that appeared was this idea of sharing information across geography, and also then how you could use your relationships in doing that. We extend our contacts across borders. And someone else says, globalization is not just about setting up an organization which covers the globe. That's the easiest part. Globalization is to establish an executive and an informal networks which cuts across the globe. So you use that, you have to think about using that informal network for communication in as many matters as possible, but you still have to do that without killing the formal organization. So we have many issues coming up here. Now, we're not just looking at sharing information inside the organization, sharing information across geography, but suddenly the partners also started to talk to me about the formal organization. So I thought, oh wow, this is really interesting. There's actually also an interrelationship between the informal network that exists in organizations and the formal organization structure. And then someone else reconfirmed this suspicion. There are networks that transcend the corporate boundaries. And so I think you'll see already that there are sort of three streams of research that kind of, or interests that appeared quite early on in my work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those three streams of research. So the first is about sharing resources in a global context. So how do you actually share resources across geography? The second is very much about how do you compete for resources within or between firms. And then the final one is this interaction between the formal structure and the informal networks. And then underneath these, I tend to ask a sort of bunch of overarching questions, but I thought I'd summarize them in two questions. So the first one is really about how resources are shared and integrated in a global context, and then how do different ties and network structures affect these processes. The second one, how do individuals compete for resources within and between organizations? And then how do different ties and network structures affect these processes? And then finally, how does the formal structure interact with these informal networks in organizations? And then how do informal ties across formal boundaries affect performance outcomes? And then underneath this, I've got a bunch of projects that kind of fall into that. Now this picture is hard to read, so what I'm going to do is go through each of these streams of research a little bit more detail, talk a little bit about what I've been working on in the past, what I'm working on in the moment, and what I hope to do in the future, to give you a little more insight. And to do that, again, I'm going to go back to my dissertation study. And here I looked at this issue of resource sharing in a global context. And this paper was published in 2010 in the Strategic Management Journal. And what I was interested in here is looking at how does the innovation process actually happen in global firms? Or specifically, how do you create new knowledge? And how is new knowledge integrated across a global context? And then, of course, again, this interest in informal networks came in. So I wanted to look at how do individuals and organizations, or senior managers and organizations, utilize their informal networks to achieve some of these processes. So what I did was collect data on senior partners in a global management consulting firm, and I looked at the individual ego networks of these partners, which resulted in about 1,449 informal relationships across the firm, and also outside the firm, and across geography. So what did I find? The key finding in this paper is that if you operate in a heterogeneous context, so for example, if you're operating across geography, across firm boundaries, you have a wide-spanning network in a large multinational firm, managers actually benefit from having density in their networks if they're trying to innovate. Whereas if you operate in a more homogeneous context, if you're operating just within your local environment or within the firm, you benefit from much more open networks in terms of innovation. And the two mechanisms that underlie these arguments is about access and integration of diverse information. So if you have exposure to very diverse information, you also have a problem of how are you going to integrate that information. And this is where the dense networks come in. So if you actually have some exchange going on between the people that you know, that will help you integrate that diverse information. Okay, so what is the contribution of this paper? Well, this key finding actually contrasts with what people have found before, because the general finding that's been in work on networks has been, well, if you have open networks, then that's always great for innovation. If your network extends widely and people don't know each other, that's really helpful for innovation. The problem with that is when I went and looked at some of these studies, a lot of them were done looking at data where you look at one office somewhere in the Midwest of the US, and everybody kind of knows each other anyway. So if you have just a little bit of openness in the network, then that's perhaps not so surprising that that will actually be helpful for innovation. And so my curiosity became when I said, well, what happens if you're operating in a context that's actually truly international and much more diverse than what we've looked at before? And so in fact, I found that there were differences in the findings. Practically, of course, this has implications for how managers might think about cross-border and cross-firm interaction. Perhaps we should facilitate and encourage more of that kind of interaction. Now, of course, anyone that comes from outside of academia will tell me this is not very easy, right? It's very difficult. And I have this discussion with my students all the time. Well, why is it not very easy? Well, because it's uncomfortable, right? We want to interact with people that we are familiar with, that we are close with. And it's also difficult because formal structures don't always encourage us to do so. So there's a lot of thinking to be done about how can we actually, in organizations, facilitate these kinds of interactions. Okay, so I have two current projects that I'm working on that seek to deepen this understanding of cross-border and cross-firm interactions. The first project is joint work with one of my main co-authors at the moment, Michelle Rogan, who's assistant professor at INSEAD in the entrepreneurship department. Michelle did her PhD at London Business School, so we've been swapping around a little bit. And in this project, we look at how managers might utilize their global networks to overcome changes in the economic environment, what we call demand versus supply constraint. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, normally, we have access to opportunities by going outside our organizations. We get access to new business opportunities. We seek internally for resources. But sometimes that doesn't always work, right? So if we have an economic crisis, it might be difficult to access new business opportunities. And so what we find is that managers can actually utilize their internal network to access new business opportunities. So they actually pass opportunities between themselves. So perhaps this is because different markets go through different cycles. And this is part of the explanation for this. In the same way, if you're supply constrained, so if you have difficulty accessing resources inside the firm, this often happens if you have an upturn in the economy, there's lots of demand, but resources then don't exist inside the firm. What do you do then? Well, you go outside the firm to access resources. So we find that they can activate different part of their network to overcome these constraints. The second project, I would say, is a little bit sort of on the boundaries of my main interest. But here I look at cross-cultural brokers, and we look at the multicultural networks and their effects on job performance in organizations. This is joint work with a lady called Canny Sue, who works in the OB department at London Business School. And she has a skill that I don't have at all. She knows how to run experiments. And so what we've done, we've combined my data and her skills at running experiments, and we're trying to look at how individuals actually respond in the lab to different what do you call them, treatments in terms of how their networks might look and how they interact. And so we find that those people who have more multicultural networks and are also able to broker across different cultures have better job performance. And we think that these findings are quite in line with what I found in my dissertation work, which was that if you have this multicultural network, well, if there's something that you can actually integrate, if there's some way in which you can integrate this exposure to diverse information, that may actually help your performance. Okay, so this is sort of what I'm doing at the moment on this stream. The second stream of research was this idea about how do you compete for resources. And here I have some joint work with Morten Hansen, who's at INSEAD, and Bjørn Løvers, who used to be at London Business School, which we published in AMJ in 2005. And here we looked at how knowledge is shared in organizations. What we did is we took the knowledge sharing process, which previously had been looked at as just how do you search for, how do you transfer knowledge, and we said, well, maybe there's actually an additional step to this process. Perhaps there's also something about the initial decision to even go out and look for knowledge. And so what we did was we broke the knowledge sharing process into 3 processes, and then we looked at how different network attributes affected different parts of this knowledge sharing process. So do you search within the team, outside the team, and so on. And we looked at 121 project development teams across 41 subsidiaries, so again, across geography of a large high-tech company. We found that perceived competition is important for both knowledge, search, and transfer processes. So there's something about how you perceive competition within organizations. Again, something that comes up several times in my research. And then also this idea of breaking down the knowledge sharing process in different steps, which hadn't been done before, was one of the main contributions of this paper. Both in terms of the knowledge sharing process, but also the different levels of the network. Now, Morten Hansen is someone who was not on my dissertation committee when I was at INSEAD. In fact, he wasn't even at INSEAD when we wrote this project. Only once it was published did he join INSEAD. But he's someone who's been, that I've known for a long time, and he's had quite a big influence on my work, as you probably see, and has also acted as a mentor throughout my research career. Another paper that falls under this stream of work is a result of my postdoc work. After I finished my PhD, I went to MIT and did a postdoc, which was also a very interesting experience because MIT is, of course, a place where people are quite focused on their research. And here I worked with a sociologist called Roberto Fernandez, who is in the organization studies group at MIT. And this paper was published in Social Science Research, which is a prominent sociology journal, in 2008. And what we did here was to study the hiring process at a call center within a large global diversified financial services firm. And we looked at how applicants at this firm were sorted into queues and then how they progressed through the hiring pipeline. So how they go from application to interview and then on to offer. And what we found is that women were more likely to be sorted into low status, low paid jobs. And once they were sorted, they were more likely to get the job. So there's something about them falling into these queues where there's lower status, they're lower paid. But then, of course, once they're sorted into that queue, they're more likely to get the job. So unfortunately, we can't tell in that paper, is it because they're more qualified? Or is it because they're just more realistic? So men always tend to apply for jobs that they're actually not qualified for. They think they're qualified for, but perhaps not. I don't know. We don't know. We can't say. Or perhaps these women are just more qualified. But the big contribution of this paper is that we're able to say more than what came before. We're able to look at applicants that compete for the same job at the same time. And we actually do see this sorting process going on. So there's really something interesting. Why is it that these women fall into these queues? The other thing we cannot, unfortunately, say something about is who does the sorting. Is it the applicants themselves that actually put themselves in that queue, Or is it the hiring agents who say, well, women should go into this queue and men should go into that queue? We don't know. Some people say, well, there's probably discrimination going on. We'll say, we can't be sure. We don't know. It could be that the women are discriminating against themselves. And my co-author, Roberto Fernandez, and I have also colleagues at London Business School who are looking at some similar issues and are now actually able to get at some of these issues. And there's actually a lot that indicates that probably there's not discrimination going on. A lot of women will be upset and surprised, but it seems that perhaps maybe women are actually discriminating against themselves, if we can say so. Then I have another paper that I'm working on at the moment on competing for resources within firms. This project is also joint with Michelle Rogan, who's at INSEAD. And on this paper, we have what's called a revise and resubmit and organization science. So fingers crossed, we'll see how that goes. But this paper, some of you may recognize. Torben Petersen very kindly gave us comments on this paper when we came to present. I came here to present it at the mini conference organized by SMG in October, I believe it was. Is that right? So we're very happy that we've now been able to get it off to a journal. What this paper does, it looks at this classic trade-off in organizations between exploring for new ideas, new opportunities, and exploiting the existing opportunities and ideas that you have in organizations. This is a difficult process because it requires different kinds of resources, different kind of processes. So there's a lot of work that talks about how do you actually manage this process, and can we actually manage it at the same time, simultaneously. And what we talk about in this literature is that organizations that are able to do this, we call ambidextrous. Ambidextrous is someone who can use both their left and their right hand equally well. And if they're ambidextrous, then they can manage these processes. There are lots of solutions to this problem. One of them being, well, we have different units. One deals with exploration, one deals with exploitation, or we do it at different points in time. First, we talk about exploring for new opportunities. Then we actually exploit those opportunities once we've found them. And then there's a lot of talk about managers being ambidextrous. But we don't know a lot about those ambidextrous managers. So Michelle and I wanted to know, do the ambidextrous managers' networks actually differ from those of other managers? Is there something about their networks that actually allow them to be ambidextrous? Perhaps they can activate different parts of their network, and that is what actually allows them to be ambidextrous. Again, we look at a large management consulting firm, senior partners. And what we find is, yes, ambidextrous managers are actually different. Their networks are actually different from other types of managers. How are they different? Well, if we look inside the firm, we find that their networks are much more heterogeneous, so much more diverse than those managers that focus only on exploiting existing information ideas, perhaps not so surprising. But they're less heterogeneous than managers that focus exclusively on exploring for new ideas, new opportunities. We also find that they have more informal ties than exploration managers, which is kind of interesting. Externally, we also find they have more informal ties than exploitation managers, but less than exploration managers, so not quite as much as they rely on their informal ties internally. And then they have lower density networks than exploitation managers outside the firm. So they have these open networks. Well, the contribution of this work is, as I said before, there's a lot of work that talks theoretically about ambidextrous managers, but there's not so much work that actually looks at what does this manager look like and how do they actually manage to be ambidextrous. There's some work that looked at the cognitive level and says it's some kind of process that you can manage in your head. But we say, well, maybe there's also something external. Maybe you can actually utilize different parts of your network. You rely on Nikolai if you want to go out and explore for new opportunities, and you rely on Torben if you want to go and actually implement those ideas. The third stream of my research is this idea of formal structures and informal networks. And here I have also some papers I'm working on at the moment. This is joint work with Susan Lynch. Susan Lynch is another PhD graduate from London Business School who now works at INSEAD, and she's in a strategy group at INSEAD. And we also have a couple of projects together. This paper looks at boundary spanning in organizations, and the title of it is The Threshold Effect of Boundary Spanning Across Knowledge Domains and Exploration. And it's also at organization science. The research question is here is how does spanning across formal knowledge domains and organizations affect exploration? So if you remember at the beginning, I talked about this interaction between not just informal networks, but also the formal structure. So how do these informal networks across formal boundaries actually affect performance outcomes? So we are interested in how these ties across the formal boundaries affect the ability to explore for new business opportunities, new knowledge. So boundary spanning has in general been associated with these outcomes. And generally, the idea is that boundary spanning is always good for these kinds of outcomes or other outcomes, that we should do as much boundary spanning as we can, or any kind of boundary spanning ties is positive. Well, we say this may not always be true. It may be that there is some constraints in terms of your boundary spanning ties. So we actually argue that it's only when you have above a certain threshold of boundary spanning ties that you start to actually get the benefit of these ties. Because it's also costly to have these kinds of ties that span boundaries. So if you're in SMG and you need to have ties into a different department, well, that's going to take time and energy to develop those ties. But if you have several ties, maybe perhaps you will start to reap some of the benefits of those ties. What we find is that if you span knowledge domains externally, that's positively associated with new business development. But if we need to develop new knowledge, what we find is that you also need boundary spanning ties internally. So again, this comes back to some of my earlier work. Perhaps there is something again to this issue of how do you actually integrate and develop new knowledge. Maybe you also need to exchange with your colleagues inside SMG to actually understand what's going on in the outside world. What are the theoretical contributions of this work? Well, it gives a little bit more insight into exploration at the individual level, but also how spanning knowledge domains support processes of exploration which we don't know so much about. Then there's this distinction between external and internal boundaries and the differences in their effects. So externally, we might benefit from spanning boundaries, but actually only if we connect into different knowledge domains, is what I find. Whereas previous work has said, well, spanning any boundary externally is good. And then it gives a little bit of a better understanding of boundary spanning as an individual capability. Another project that I'm doing within this stream of work is also with Michelle Rogan at INSEAD, where we look at the investment of resources in professional relationships. So what we're interested in knowing here is how does the investment of different types of resources affect firm growth? Now, we generally know that if you're going to build and maintain relationships, you have to invest in them. Otherwise, they're going to die off, you're going to lose contact, so you have to spend time. And that also means you are constrained in which relationships you can build. Now, what types of resources do we actually invest in relationships? Well, if we think about relationships perhaps that we have at an academic institution like CBS with external partners, it may be that someone comes in and says, I want to work with Nikolaj Foss because he's Nikolaj Foss, and I don't care if he's at CBS or if he's at University of Southern Denmark or at London Business School or where he is, because I want to talk to Nikolaj Foss. Or it may be that someone comes in and says, I want to talk to Nikolaj Foss, or I want to talk to Torben, or I want to talk to someone else, it doesn't matter. But I only want to talk to them because they're at CBS, and I know that CBS is a great institution, and that's where I've come to. So in the first case, we think much more about that relationship as a relationship where Nikolaj has invested his personal resources, whereas the second type of relationship, it's much more about investing firm resources. Now, as you'd imagine, most of the times, firms encourage that we invest firm resources, we build firm relationships. Why is that? Well, because if we have personal relationships, Nikolaj may say, well, I'm going to leave CBS, and I'm going to take all my relationships with me, if they're all personal relationships. Whereas they're firm relationships, Nikolaj can leave, but CBS will retain the relationships. So it's sort of a trade-off between these type of relationships. Again, we look at senior partners in a consulting firm. We here focus only on the external networks because we're interested in these client relationships what happens with them. And what we find is that if you invest individual resources, that actually positively influences the manager's ability to grow the firm. So although firms may find it risky to invest personal resources, it is perhaps actually a good strategy to encourage this, and something, I guess, for managers to think about when they're often encouraging only the development of firm resources. And specifically, if we break it down, we try to look at different types of networks. So when you do network theory, network analysis, you can look at different types of networks or the types of ties that you develop. And so we distinguish between those ties that you use to access new knowledge or to develop new skills. And there we find actually the strongest effects. And these effects are greatest in networks that have quite low density. So again, networks that are open. And we're still kind of trying to think about why these effects appear, especially the open networks. So I'd be happy to discuss with you if you have ideas here. So what are some of the contributions of this work? Well, what we do here is we examine network content in a quite different way than what people have done before. We're trying to look more specifically at what actually flows in the relationship. And there's very little work that has actually looked at that so far. Most of the work on networks look at structure and look at the direct effect with performance, but doesn't really look at what flows in the tie. And so we're interested in getting more of an understanding of this. And then we also look at the interrelationship with structure, with the interaction effects. And as I said, this has implication for strategy implementation in that firms might consider encouraging the use of individual resources when building and maintaining relationships. Another project I'm doing at the moment has to do with formal structure. It's also joint work with Susan Lynch. And here we look at how formal change affects the ability to build and maintain relationships. So, of course, when you change formal organization structures, there will be some ties that break, but new ties will also form. Now, if you go and talk to managers or you talk to MBA students about this, they will say, yes, of course, that's a classic problem. We all know that that exists, and we can have interesting discussions in an MBA classroom about this. But still, if you go and look at the literature, it's sorely understudied. Very few people have looked at this. We don't know much about it. Lots of students will come to me and say, can I read a paper about this? Are there some published findings? No, there's not really. There's very little work done here. So we're hoping to make some progress on this. And actually, Susan, in her dissertation, has some very interesting data where she can look at a formal change and has data over time, so she can look at what goes on. And I think this is also quite related to a project I've spoken to Torben. Torben's doing a project with Mia Reinholdt, and I think that project kind of has the project that you're doing at the moment has some interesting connections with this project. What are some of the future work that falls under this category? Well, I'm also doing some work with David Wagespack, who's at the University of Maryland, where we're looking at collaboration across firm and geographic boundaries. No surprise, this is one of my interests. And so it so happens that Dave has some very interesting data where I'd be able to look at some of these things. And so we're collaborating on this at the moment. And the data he has is on an open source community. He has the collaborations of 7,307 unique individuals that participate in what's called the Internet Engineering Task Force in the period from 1986 to 2002. Now, I don't know very much about open source communities or this data in particular. And for those of you who don't know about it, the Internet Engineering Task Force, they create standards for the Internet and actually develop new ways of how the Internet operates. And so they cooperate on projects and co-author projects across different firms, across geography, and then they publish them, and then they become Internet standards. And so what we'd like to look at is how some of these collaborations develop over time, and then of course in particular if there's collaborations across geography or across firms, does that make it more difficult? Does that change the outcome of the project? Does that make it more easy to collaborate or more interesting outcomes in terms of the projects? The other thing I'd like to do in the future, which I haven't gotten so far yet, is to do more longitudinal work. Most of my work so far has been cross-sectional, which means that it's very hard to establish a direction of causality. Can we say that the network structure or the network variable actually causes the performance, or is it the other way around? Does the network tie exist because we have a certain performance? It's very hard to say for me, for sure. Now, of course, we have all kinds of controls, and you have all kinds of things that you do in your papers to overcome this problem, but you can never completely get away with it unless if you've got work that develops over time. And then I've had some discussion with Adam Kleinbaum, who does work closely related to mine. He's at Tuck University. He did his PhD at Harvard Business School. And most recently, we talked about looking at some of these issues, also related to this project that I'm doing with Michelle Rogan, of the personal versus professional aspects of relationships and how that affects performance in organizations. And then we've also had some brief discussions about women versus men and their professional networks and how they develop in terms of do they use different network strategies. But we're not sure if that's something we're going to pursue. We'll see where that goes. Okay. So if I'm going to sum up, you've got now quite a good idea of, I hope, otherwise please come and ask me questions, the general gist of my work, I would say. What is the different streams and the kind of questions that I'm interested in asking. But I would say the general aim of my work is to study larger strategy questions. Now, what I do is I look at individual level mechanisms, but I would like to make a contribution that's larger than the individual level mechanisms. What I'd like to do is to use those to understand larger strategy questions in organizations. How do they actually lead to firm performance? I use network methodology. You'll see networks in most of my papers, I think. But I don't actually consider myself necessarily a network theorist. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I'd like to make a contribution to network theory if I can, but I don't see that. I hope that's not the only place that I can make a contribution. I do hope, as I said, to also make a contribution to some of the larger strategy questions. And then finally, I hope to make a contribution by getting at some of these underlying level micro foundations of strategy and entrepreneurship. And this is something there's been quite a bit of call for recently in both the strategy and the entrepreneurship literature, because we know a lot about the overarching questions, but we don't really know what's going on underneath. And so by studying some of these individual level mechanisms, I do hope to be able to make a contribution at these to these kind of streams of work. And of course, this is an ongoing process, and you never know, hopefully we'll get there. Okay. So to sum up, I'd say that there are many unanswered questions, lots of work still to be done, and many other interests that I'd like to pursue. And so I hope that you'll also see that there are opportunities for collaborations and things we can do. The bad news is, you know, how long does it take to make real progress, right? I've taken you through now 14 years of my research agenda, and wow, it takes a long time. I hope that don't be discouraged, PhD students. You know, it does take a long time before you start to feel that you make progress. The good news is that, you know, I still have learned a lot. I've worked with some great people. I think I've made some progress over the years. I think it's also good news that there's lots of work still to be done. Right? It would be boring if my research agenda stopped here. So I do hope that there's lots of things to come. And I hope that also means that there are many opportunities, as I said, for future collaborations with both faculty and PhD students, both at CBS but also outside. And so I do hope that all of you, based on this, will get in touch if you feel that there are things that we could work on together. I'd be very excited about that. And so I think I'm going to leave it at that and just say if there are questions, and if there are no questions, we could discuss them over a drink, perhaps. And that's all I have.